Welcome everyone to this week's IMAG MSM Working Group on Multi-Scale Modeling and Viral Pandemics. We have our usual slide deck. I believe today that James Glazier and Tomas Helikar won't be able to make it. I think they're both traveling and at conferences. The fall conference schedule has started up, so people are traveling. So as usual, Tom and James are, as I said, traveling. They're the leads of the group. Myself and Lorenzo take care of coordinating activities, maintaining the social media and the web pages, and etc. Our usual, we have our Slack channel, and people feel free to use, as well as our Twitter. Hopefully you got our Twitter message. I wonder if I should change this to be something like X. It's no longer Twitter. Our wiki page is up and running, and it'll have the slide deck and a link to the video in a couple of days. It has all the links to all the old videos and old slide decks as well. We've got LinkedIn, our YouTube channel as usual. Again, looking for support for GLIMPRINT, the Global Alliance for Immune Prediction and Intervention. You can go to glimprint.org for more information. We could definitely use help getting web pages set up and getting that going. Our Twitter address, MSM Viral. Again, this probably should have a big X there now. There are a whole bunch of current funding announcements. EU has several of them. The CDF project, EU Horizon project. This is got a relatively short deadline of 16 January. Another Horizons project, which is also January 16th deadline. If you're interested in applying to one or more of those grants, and you're interested in maybe finding somebody else in this group that might want to participate, you could post to our Slack channel and see if you could drum up a collaborator or two. Another EU Horizons one that's a little bit farther out, not till March of next year. And then a final one also in January of next year for EU Horizons. So the EU has a whole bunch of open RFAs, at least 2 of them that end in the next month or so, and a couple that end at the beginning of next year, or the deadlines are in the beginning of next year. The NSF has a couple of open ones. This particular one, November 15th deadline, so that's coming up pretty close. That's what, 6 weeks from now. The Ecology and Evolution of Infectious Diseases. And another one that's also due at the beginning of November, Smart Health and Biomedical Research in the area of artificial intelligence and advanced data science. So that's all the pending funding announcements. Does anyone have any short announcements they'd like to make? Okay, I'll move along. We do not have a viral pandemic steering committee tomorrow, even though tomorrow is our regularly scheduled date, mostly because Thomas and James are traveling. So schedule for upcoming seminars, October 19th, 2 weeks from now, Bruce Lee from City University of New York. And that's also the week that will be our 3-year anniversary for this group. And then on November 2nd, Lisbeth Garris from ULege and KU Leuven. November 60, Pete Vandergraaf. We have an open slot November 30, and December 14, which I believe is our last meeting for 2023, is Tongli Zhang. There's a tiny URL here if you'd like to suggest some speakers. I'll put it in the chat. You can always use suggestions for speakers. So if we have nothing else, we're ready for this week's mini seminar. It's Lorenzo Veschini from King's College London. Advances in Personalized Cancer Diagnosis, Prognosis, and Therapy with AI. Unraveling Tumor Morphology, Microenvironments, and Sharing Knowledge. And without further ado,
So, hello everybody, I'm Lorenzo, and today I want to share with you some ideas about advancing the diagnosis and prognosis and therapy of cancer with AI, and especially we will look at some imaging technique to unravel tumor morphology, the microenvironment, and I would like to discuss a few ideas about sharing knowledge. The infographic here is just a general depiction of what we know about cancer, its microenvironment. We have some theoretical knowledge that is written in textbook and many papers. We also have data from model systems or in vitro system, all sorts of experimental system, and we have patients data, population data, which can come in the form of images or patient samples, clinical records of the patients, omics data, maybe genomics, maybe transcriptomic, proteomic, all sorts of things. And when we think about cancer care, all of this information, all of this data has to be accounted in the head of the clinical team, each member of the clinical team, including pathologists, on which we will focus a little bit more today. And there might be an headache to actually try to give the best care to patients. And what I'm proposing today, obviously I'm not the first doing that, and it's just a theme of discussion, that we should be digitalizing and using information technology to facilitate, accelerate, automate all of this process, so that eventually we can even build models, either statistic or mechanistic, that can help us personalize, inform, optimize the therapy of patients, increasing quality of life and health, and also helping us understanding the cancer to develop better therapies. And I say that we'll focus mostly on patient-derived images today, but I will pick in other contexts as well. I said that we'll talk about images and where images of cancer come from mostly. There are many modalities, but diagnostic histopathology is one of the most important, because diagnostic histopathology, which seeks to diagnose, prognose, recommend optimal treatment in cancer care, cannot be diagnosed without microscopy. So most cancer cannot be diagnosed without this procedure, and so almost all cancer are placed by this diagnostic histopathology. This normally follows a standardized procedure. The tissue sample gets to pathology department, is being processed, and the pathologist accesses a diagnostic slide, which can be visualized either analogically or digitally. And the pathologists also have access to clinical data and to gross features of these suspected tumor mass. The analysis of the histological slides is normally a very analogical procedure done by hand by the pathologist, which rely on their prior knowledge and guidelines, which I've learned after normally very intensive training. And I say they will analyze the gross morphology of the tumor, the microscopic morphology of what they see. These are some images. And we'll try to map some features, which knows being important of the specific cancer they are trying to diagnose or prognose, etc., recording them, and then with these inputs, they will be able to eventually navigate some decisional tree, some diagnosis process, whereby they will eventually lead to a diagnosis of certain cancers, no cancer, of certain cancer subtype A or B or C, and that will automatically also lead to some decision about the therapy. So diagnostic histopathology is part of diagnosis, therapy, and then together with all the knowledge pathologists and the whole clinical team has, and clinical data and so on, they can also make some prediction about what they do expect from this particular patient and the outcome given the condition we have. And here, again, I will concentrate a little bit for now on diagnostic slides, and so what we can do about that. And the challenges particular field are for sure that specialized pathologists are operating with high workloads, and so this comes with some backdrops, like might lead to observer bias, leads for sure of their having too much work to do. And the second box here actually highlights observer bias, which is intrinsic to the process because it's manual. And so it depends from who's actually performing it for as much as they can be trained. And then on top of, to contribute to this bias, it comes that the human variability, which is evident for cancer, both for across populations, which are, we know that they have different incidence of certain type of cancer, certain particular manifestation of those, and also within the same population, we know that there is variability. And this problem of variability affects both the problem of observer bias and further on when we try to diagnose and personalize the therapy, which we really don't do nowadays, or we do a little bit less probably that we could do. Let's say this is the hypothesis for today. So in fact, we normally take a population, we try to stratify with the means that we discussed before or other means. For sure, we had other data beyond the histopathology data, and we decide about some category, which will eventually lead to select a type of therapy, dose of therapy, and schedule of therapy for that particular patient. This happens a little bit at the population level. We normally take some threshold or some average measurement that have been shown to work for most of the population. This leads to some problems, which are typically under treatment or over treatment. The former being the fact that perhaps we might give a little bit too little or not the exact right thing that works for a patient, and the therapy fails. Or over treatment. Sometimes we give a little bit too much to the patient or something that is not really perfectly fit for them, and we might have a therapeutic effect, but then we have also therapeutic side effects, which sometimes are to cure the disease and we provoke another disease. And so these are the challenges that I'll try to discuss today. And I say here promise and challenges of computational pathology. This might extend to other fields as well. But one by one, I would say that to address the first two bits, one thing that we can do, and I would say that I believe that the technology is very much here today. Perhaps there is need for a lot of work to actually implement this technology into something useful, but the promise is that we can automate, standardize the acquisition, quantification, and analysis of these histopathological data, so we can for sure relieve the workload. We can standardize, so we eliminate, in principle, observer bias. And when we automate these procedures, then it becomes a little bit easier to measure all that we know, all the predictive features that we know about histopathological data in all patients at all times, which is not the typical thing that pathologists do. Sometimes, most time, the pathologists, again, they have a lot of diagnosis to do, and they will looking for specific features which allow them to give a certain diagnosis with a good confidence, and then will kind of reduce the diagnosis, compile the report, and perhaps compare with that of a colleague just to make sure. And then if they agree, they will emit the diagnosis. It will never or hardly happens that they measure all the hypotheses or the predictive feature that have been discussed in the literature regarding that particular type of cancer, and very hardly they will quantify anything in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4. They might have emit some kind of categories, high, low, medium level of, I don't know, infiltrate of immune cells. Anyway, once we can do this automatically, then we can obviously make another thing. We can store, share, appraise across the whole population all this data. That's obviously in the future, because there are many problems about data protection, regulations, etc. But once we can do this, we can for sure address the problem of variability within and across population in a much more solid way. And once we have this, we can try probably also, okay, we can start already, but once we have much bigger data set, we can address in a much more comprehensive way the problem of diagnosis and personalization. So with advanced statistic or even simple machine learning algorithm, we can try to explain, correlate, weight, and multiple histopathological features that we measure automatically, we said, and against clinical outcomes. And this can create models, statistical or machine learning like, and this can for sure help us refine stratification, prognosis, therapeutic regime. And I hope I will show you some example, convincing example about this today. And what we would really like to do in the future is to actually create mechanistic models. So statistical models, for how predictive they can be, they are not mechanistic. We will discuss that a little bit more later. And ideally, we would like to create some generic model encompassing all the mechanisms that we know about the particular type of cancer, and good enough that we can even tune them, knowing some specific inputs from the patient. That specific inputs might be our multi-dimensional data from pathology, from the clinic, etc. But then we have a problem that we need still this generalistic model, and I will address how we might try to do that, or at least start doing that, because that will be obviously very important to infer patient-specific disease progression, response to therapies, in precision medicine approaches. And the last thing we'll try to address today is how we can use all of these new techniques and the knowledge generated by to create also something that is useful for teaching and for training of professionals, and in general create content-rich pedagogic material which can augment students or learning experience by giving their own piece and etc. And so, moving forward, in the next slide, I will present a few works that we have done in the past few years that try to go in this direction. So these are examples, and I hope I will convince that the route is good, at least. So this first work is something where we actually didn't use AI at all. It's just a simple initial work, relatively simple initial work, where we use standard image analysis to appraise the bone of irradiated patients. The very interesting peculiarity of this work is that we had an advantage that we could retrieve histological material that could be processed for histology of irradiated bones, and we could have multiple samples undergoing having experienced different degree of radiation. And also we could access the sample after they got the radiation. So we had an ideal system where we can try to establish a correlation, and the question was whether the dose radiation could correlate with microvascular density reduction in irradiated jaws. This is an hypothesis that was posed because we know that irradiated jaws are having a number of problems, and these problems are very problematic in themselves for example, for rehabilitation via implants or very other means. So our study had this advantage, having internal control. Unfortunately, we couldn't gather very many samples. But the take-home message of this slide is trying to set the field for what I want to say later, is that by analyzing histological slides systematically in images of those, we can really create somehow correlations, and especially if you do systematically analyze this image, means doing it automatically. In this case, we just generate an algorithm, a macro in J, and that was sufficient for this essentially univariate problem where we want just to correlate our radiation dose with this readable parameter variable of our interest. And we actually succeeded in that. And the interesting bit is that this work advocates for using adjuvant vascular protection therapy in RT, especially if the dose of radiation has gone beyond a certain threshold. And more perhaps interesting to the topics we are discussing today, we could establish a relationship for how raw it is, and needs obviously to be validated and with further data, etc. That is some mechanistic rule between two very high level function. One is actually the physiology of a bone that is being irradiated or not. And the second is the fact that there are more or less blood vessels that are useful for the bone nourishment in that particular bones. And so this is interesting. And so it might tell us something if we want to model that microenvironment in a more broader sense. But what we don't know is what is in between. And so this is the first milestone, or one of what we did initially. And later on, we said, okay, can we do a little bit more, slightly different context where things are complex, even more complex. We don't know, we have few hypotheses about the predictivity of certain parameters in histological slide of cancer. To start, we used a very well-characterized retrospective cohort of patients with a certain specific type of oral cancer, which underwent similar treatment. And since the cohort is retrospective, we had outcome data for all these patients. And this favorable outcome, we considered 5 years without recurrence of the cancer. Our hypothesis is that since this special type of head and neck cancer, they tend to to respond well to therapy, but still a few of those, they don't really respond well. So there is an opportunity for de-escalating a bit the therapy in those that are favorable outcome, while we don't want to do that for those that don't have this favorable outcome, but we don't know that a priori. And that the question was, can we accurately predict patient outcome just by using diagnostic hematoxin and eosin images, slides and then images? And these are those, if you remember the very first slide or second, where I say that essentially we have one or more of these for each single patient that is being diagnosed with most type of cancer. And for this specific type of cancer, it's invariant. We have all the slides for all patients if we were able to access all of this material. Okay, a little bit, we concentrate about trying to create features that are explainable, because we used a little bit of AI to actually segment and then classify our different cell type. And we concentrated on single cell analysis. And only using diagnostic H&E slides. The disadvantage is that we not even close encompass all the features that are kind of been associated with the prognosis of these cancers. So we selected a few, which are kind of, some are well known, some are less known, and we put them, measure them all together in all the sample that we had. This heat map give us the sense that you can see that the pink dots are patients or images which are the unfavorable prognosis. The green ones are those that have favorable prognosis. We put all of this data after measuring, again, automatically, single cell, and we used a little bit of machine learning for both segmentation and classification. And we put them into statistical models or further AI models to try to infer the outcome, our favorable versus unfavorable outcome in the population. So the results are that using the neural network model, and with a little lesser extent with the logistic regression, which was a standard statistic, we get very interesting outcome, very interesting prediction, which were about 86% if we accumulate 5 slides for each patient. When we analyze 5 slides for each patient, we can reach this kind of accuracy. And the interesting bit is that, in my opinion, the aims of our talk today, is that this kind of accuracy is captured by relatively few variables and only in histological slide. This means that these might contain the information, the mechanistic information that actually justified as the fact that certain patients do well and certain patient doesn't do well. So this is another proof of feasibility that I think highlights how interesting is this route of research. By no means I want to claim myself as a pioneer or even an expert in the field, and this is easily demonstrated by just PubMeding these few words. And I did it this morning, retrieving 9,500 results just in the past 10 years. So the field is very hot, and I think it's worth being there, and it's worth using that for probably even more for reasons that I will explain in the next slide. So here I move a little bit of field for just quickly, just to discuss the fact that we can use the same imaging technique to measure in vitro experiment. Like in this case, we were measuring endothelial cells and monolayer of those, and we can do it very reproducibly without the advantage that we discussed for automatization of quantification of images, right? And the interesting bit is that we can use this kind of biological system to infer some biological function and to actually evaluate the effect of our hypothesis, molecule of interest, or even patient samples. In this case, a few years back, we, for example, associated the permeability in cells that looks exactly like this against supernatant obtained for patients with cardiovascular disease, and we find out that the assay was predictive of the cardiovascular events, dependently on what they had in their epicardial tissue at that time. Going fast on this, this is one further microphysiologic system or system that are able to mimic the dynamic crosstalk of cell within engineered natural tissue. We developed this vascular chip platform. I don't want to stay long on this. The take-home message is that with this reductionist system, they are reductionist. You don't have to tell her that they are as complex as the real biological system, but can help us appraising dynamic crosstalk of cells within that particular system. And for example, we did that by using our vascular chip with pancreatic organoids, and we can looking at this image, the main thing that is evident is that spatial relationship between different cells are actually changing the signaling in cells. And so this is a very early and simple proof of principle, but is yet already interesting. So just to go fast on this and not abusing too much my time, can microphysiological system and AI perhaps help us creating mechanistic model? Otherwise said, with what we have discussed so far, we can explain, correlate, weight multimodal pathological features, but we can do it in a somehow statistical way. So our correlation, we know, doesn't imply causation. So we cannot really say, okay, this is the mechanism that justify and that cause this disease or that cause this particular condition. We would like to go there and to create the models that we are discussing at the beginning, so that we can even test to run virtual clinical trials, test multiple therapies on our patients, knowing when we tune them, etc., and so on. So for now, we are not there, and just with this, we could start using explainable AI, as I hope I just speaking to, and we can also, once we have a new hypothesis or confirmed hypothesis obtained through explainable AI or analysis of histopathological data, we can then test these hypotheses with experimental data, which might be already done, or we might actually do new one. But perhaps the most intriguing and interesting bit that we could discuss today is what if we really want to go into mechanistic models for all sorts of reasons. And the problem is, I believe that nowadays we lack sufficient knowledge and dynamic interaction between cells and tissues to really build fully mechanistic models. This is just an example depiction of this problem. So we have whatever thyroid cancer in this case is picked from this particular paper. We see that there are various cells and cell type involved: the cancer cells, the vascular cells, the lymphatic vessel, a whole catalog of immune cells, and we have to imagine that each and one of these arrows represent some relationship. So we know, in principle, looking at this, oh, fantastic, M2 cell will probably go in the tumor and provoke angiogenesis, looking at this arrow, what it says. But then we don't know, okay, we cannot build a mechanistic model on this because we don't know how many of these cells will go in, how much of this they will produce, how many they will be killed in the process, how many they will effectively do the job. And this is valid for all of this. So I'm proposing that by using microphysiological system or systems that are a little bit more complex than the computational in vitro system, which put together in 2 or 3D more cells and observe the relationship, can bridge this gap, can mimic certain part of the biology. And better than this, we can measure with very high efficiency and throughput all of these interactions. So we can start building the rules, the dynamic, the kinetic law that we would like to have to build. Mechanistic model, like for example, this is one example that is been tried before. It encompasses a few parameters that already give a sense of what can happen during a tumor growth. But if we want to complicate that with all of this information, we really need the data to do so. And my hypothesis is that for this reason, microphysiological systems are one of the key that can be used to achieve that. These are because they allow to observe, measure tissue, cellular, and molecular dynamics in a cost-effective way. They are flexible. There are plenty of cell biology tools available. We can do transgenic humans, not transgenic humans, transgenic human experiment, because we can use human cells, and we normally do use human cells. We can do functional tracking, and so they are ideal for hypothesis testing. On top of that, they are amenable to high throughput screening. So they are ideal to measure the effect on many experimental perturbations, so they are very good in creating new hypotheses. And finally, they can be eventually personalized and using patient cell or cell models reproducing patient-specific feature like some mutation. And potentially in the future, whole tissue, and they will be ideal to validate new therapies, understanding, explaining variability across different patients. So just to wrap up, I think AI and MPS can be joined together to yield a much better understanding of the tumor microenvironment, because I'm interested in tumor in this particular presentation today, but for sure there are other fields in which where this particular system can be applied to. And joining this together, I believe can give us very much more information that is so highly demanded. And I will just like to close on the teaching side, of the knowledge transfer side. Say that ideally, if we had all these beautiful single cell data about our cancer microenvironments, and we have stored them in some somewhere, we could try to do something for that. So we have to imagine that nowadays the typical medicine, dentistry, or even a trainee in pathology might be faced with this kind of situation where they have a theoretical knowledge written in textbook that says, oh, cancer microenvironment does it like this, it's like that, it's encompasses this and this cell, and there are many papers saying that. And then they might be faced also with some other textbook or atlas. We say, okay, this looks like that under the eye of a pathologist, it has this shape, you should look for this feature that are listed here, and so on and so forth. And this is how pathologists and students learn pathology. And one day they might have their own slide that they won't be praised, perhaps on an exam, or perhaps actually in their job if they do pathology. So keeping the focus on learning, what if our student was faced with something like this instead? Same tissue, whereby some computer magic has helped us cementing all cells, and so they are highlighted, and whereby by clicking on each of the cells, the student, learner can access some content rich. Now, these are mock-ups, so my is not very well developed yet. We are working, this is very much working in progress with some colleagues, and but this gives us the idea of what kind of information. And I think that within this tool, we might even have further links, and in the future, we might think that all of these might be stored digitally, cloud eventually, or as a repository, and be double cross-linked with other resources. Again, this is a funny mock-up that I just did to simulate a wiki. And this wiki, accessing for this tool, we might be able to access the wiki, and we might ask whatever, what is oral cancer? We want to look, or what is a a basal cell, or what is a squamous cells, or what is a lymphocyte, and so on, and study cancer microenvironment. This might be, again, embedding clickable or browsable features, and in the future, just for fun, but not so much because it's becoming very, very much a technology nowadays, having chatbots that perhaps we can ask them human-like question and receive answer to our queries, and perhaps go back and being addressed back to some exemplary features in our pathological slide. So all of these, I believe, that could augment the learning experience, make it more accessible, more personable, because beside the front-end lecture, the student might have their own time access this material and study that. Might integrate across scales and topics. So here today we have discussed pathology, histopathology only, essentially, and a little bit of in vitro, but nobody prevents to fill this kind of knowledge base with clinic, diagnostic, biological image. And we know, for example, that I think is the news of these days, that the new version of ChatGPT can browse the internet. So I'm sure that if we can train specific large language model to be a little bit more domain specific, that they will be able, it will be easy to access all sorts of information. For the academic routine, that might add some ease in designing self-evaluation exercise for students, where they might present a bit the empty slide and might be asked themselves to segment and to click on the cells and label them, and that can be automatically evaluated. And in the future, pending regulatory issues and all of that that needs to be in place, that might be also used to streamline exam marking, for sure, by rendering them absolutely standardized and more less discutable, let's say. And so with this, I wanted to close. I hope I didn't overuse my time, and I hope I give you a glimpse into how we can try to turn all of these bunch of data from the heads of busy clinician into computers, or being helped by computers to actually develop some statistic mechanistic model and yield all the results that we want to achieve, like understanding cancer microenvironment, minimize for personalized treatment, increase quality of life of patients and their health. And with this, I would really like to thank you for your attention. We're happy to pick any question you might have. If you don't have anybody who want to reach out to me, you can do it at this mail address. And thank you again.
Thank you, Lorenzo. We have certainly some time left. Does anybody have any questions or any issues they'd like to bounce off Lorenzo? If not, I'll start one real quick. Lorenzo, a couple slides back, you had the CompuCell tumor vascular model.
Yeah.
So I know people have discussed this before, but your classifier on the histology and immunohistochem slides generates a set of somewhat cryptic descriptors for every slide. Some of the descriptors are kind of interpretable, like cell counts, number of nuclei. So those cell descriptors there. Others of them are pretty cryptic and they're difficult to interpret.
Yeah.
But what I was thinking is, what would happen if you took this trained AI and gave it a section through Abbas's vascular tumor model? So it was the network was trained on histology and H&E or immunohistochem images, but then you presented it a model. If the same set of metrics would be applicable to the model, and basically the same weighting on the metrics would be applicable to the model. Can you do transfer learning from real samples to a model? And longer term, flipping it around, okay, we'll generate the initial model, initial AI model from a spatial mechanism-based model, and then try and apply that to actual histology images. So another way of putting it, so Abbas's model, the vascular tumor model, if you took a slice through that and then took that 2D image and just treated it just like one of these immunohistochem images and gave it to this trained AI, could it make a prognosis prediction?
But that's actually what is the first thing I would think if we had a very complete model and we will do a slice out of our model, then we use the same exact, we try to make all efforts in such way that the slice looks like a proper histological image, then our model should be applicable, and then we can essentially compare biologic versus synthetic data, and that will be a lovely matrix for doing a parameter scan over whatever we want. So, and to perhaps analyze which of the parameters of the model are important for that specific tumor. And this way, we can say, okay, this patient has a great probability of having this kind of parameter set, so we should try to run some in silico trials with different drugs on this parameter set. So that will be the tuning, I think, of one of the way of tuning such a model. And in terms of, I want to comment on this because it is important about the features that are, some are explainable, some are not. This is a kind of, even if it's published very recently, is an early effort for us. We insisted on trying to really put something we knew about the tumor, but we wanted to leave the door open to say, okay, can the machine learn something that we don't know? Will that be important in comparison to our own features? Somehow, some were important, but the most important statistically, according to traditional statistics, so statistical significant, agreeing to a monovariate Kruskal-Wallis test, are those that are explainable. But there is some contribution when we look at both at the logistic regression and the neural network of the unexplained variables. The aim will be to have everything explainable. And when I then later say that we should use explainable AI, I always think about that we should use explainable AI, both in the language of AI, which means that we have a regressor that can tell us, or an intercept during the execution of our model that give us the data and say, okay, we know the weights at this step in time that is useful, but also that that we predict what we do predict are biologically meaningful information. So I wouldn't try, it can be useful for discovery, but I wouldn't try to do embeddings, for example, to discover the best feature in a histological slide, because the machine will find beautiful things, but then it will be very hard to link them with the biology. And so that will defeat the purpose of trying to get into the mechanism.
In the slide you showed, is that list of features, the complete list of features, or is that you've selected out the features that are useful?
These are, I think this is the figure of the paper. So in this list, we put, we did essentially a transition paper where we did a little bit of traditional statistics and a little bit of AI. We used AI for segmentation, for classification, and at the end for the model, for prediction. But then all of these are so-called, what we say, statistically significant. We did multivariate and univariate tests on each of those across all the samples, and those that had p smaller than 0.05 are listed here. There were some others, not very many others, that weren't significant statistically, and I don't think, if I remember well, are not included in this particular depiction. But they are nonetheless included in the neural network model. So they contribute with their weight. Might be noise, but they contribute with their weight.
Okay, then I'll ask another one. One common thing that people have thought about is so taking for instance, these images here, as you add noise and you start to degrade the image, the prediction may or may not be valid for some level of noise. But I'm kind of interested in the reverse process. Instead of adding noise, remove detail. So if you'd imagine taking one of these images and cartoonizing it, which is to say that, you have nice sharp edges and the image has a total of exactly 5 colors, or some quite limited number of colors in the image. And then see if the classifier can still treat it properly. See, so these are highlighted. So if you just got rid of everything that's not one of your nice clean blobs,
Okay. Here we had a long discussion about this with Jonas and Selvam. So the pathologists, let's take the two fields separate. The pathologists will tell you, I pick at this slide at this resolution, and I already know what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Because I'm trained and I know what I'm looking. I don't need to see the specific nucleus to know that this is probably a tumor and that will be hot or cold, dependently how blue it looks at low resolution, right? But here we need to do the exercise for the machine. The machine doesn't have all this intelligence that helps to really integrate all of this knowledge. We can teach them to integrate the knowledge. In this process, we discussed that we can do a lot of things. If we design a neural network nowadays, you can do really whatever you want. And one thing you can do is design different neural networks that look at different resolution and then merge the results. But another thing that really nowadays is I think the gold standard in the field is the convolutional neural network that does exactly that, what you say. It annoys the image, or it subsample it, and you decide how to subsample the image, and so it adds noise, or it makes less the edges less sharp, and so on and so forth. And you can, if you want, but is really looking at the guidelines, is not really advised in this, if you use CNNs, to augment the image. But you could do that. You can rotate this image. You can take a nucleus. They give different size, give some that are a little bit artificially blurred, artificially decontrast. You can do, and in principle, your neural network will be more generalizable. No, it won't be really going down into the precise. I think the answer is. We need the both. We need all the scales, or the most important scales. And so we have to listen to pathologists to tell us what really tend to be important. But then with this idea of convolutional neural network, we can really rely on some degree of blurriness or change that might help our network to be generalizable while we don't do too much, because it can also become very slow. The more you add to the network to do them, the more it gets slow.
Well, the reason I asked about cartoonizing is because that's what a computational model is going to present. Is it's going to generate a cartoon. It's going to have exactly six colors with perfect contrast and sharp boundaries. And so the question is, if you start with a cartoonized model, can you transfer it into something that looks like a real H&E section? Or alternative, you start with an H&E section, can you transfer it into a cartoonized model? And where in that process does it break? Just how far can you go before your neural net trained on real H&E sections just can't go past this step of cartoonization before it breaks down? It just gives up and it can no longer find what you're looking for.
So let me see if I got the question right. If we were doing the slice from the model, as we said before, that is exactly perfect boundaries and really a depiction of this. Yeah. I think when we will be doing that, we should look at what we have at hand, and we can find a few strategies to do that. In one sense, we could create a spatial neural network to compare those, where we train, let's say, we have the histological image and the model corresponding to our histological image that we artificially created to be the same, and we tell the computer these are the same, and so they become one, the augmented version of the other, and if we give them a lot to do, a lot to train on to the neural network, they start to recognize one or the other independently without big problems. But we can be a little bit more prescriptive, and if we just don't use the model to measure our histology, and then we have our simulation, which have our parameters, which actually reproduce what we are measuring in the histology, we might not need to apply the neural network to the slice of the tumor. We might just take the parameters that are already there and just map them against the data, histological data. These obviously depend how we will do that work.
Yeah, though the convolutional neural networks and neural networks in general, when applied to an image, have the capability of retaining spatiality. And that's a really, really difficult thing to embed in data otherwise without actually having an image. It's easy to get nuclei count and dead cell counts and, Th1 positive cells and that get those numerical values. But presumably these networks are looking at something much more complex than just counts of cells, counts of dead cells, counts of gray area, things like that.
Actually, in this case, let's say, to go into the technical, the little rainbowy colors are just to visualize, but one neural network, which is convolutional, does the segmentation. It doesn't care about anything else but finding the blue contours and give you the segmentation. Then this is not done yet in this. This segmentation, the interesting thing is that we managed to do this kind of image, which is a 1024 by 1024 in RGB. So it's a decently big image in 1.3 seconds, which is not bad, I think. So we can do a whole slide scan which contain 10,000, 20,000 of those and have these read out in few 10, 20 minutes, something like that. And let's say the next step is to label all of those, not all of them, label a few of those with categories that we think are important, and then train a neural network to learn how to tell me that is a basal cell, this is another basal cell, this might be a spinal cell, and there will be immune cells here, and to classify. Once we get there, then we can apply these as we did before, all to measure everything, and say, okay, give me the stats about, I know that this patient went well and this patient didn't, so tell me what did statistically did happen. Then instead, if we are going into building and then using the mechanistic model, we could use just the measurements probably, and then it will be kind of straightforward. That's why I'm insisting in general to the value of co-developing these things, because then we are finding many other cases in many other situations how much there are two things that should crosstalk. Don't do it, because okay, the developers have taken the routes that make at the end very difficult, a big job just to make the things compatible and crosstalk. But yes, I think it's very feasible, actually not complicated, but I think it's a problem that needs to be known now, so that when we develop the models, we are already ready. And ideally, I'm also saying we should be taking these kind of images, put them into platform like Computational, and then starting cell by cell teaching the rules. We will have cell types, and we will have to probably via the categories tries to establish the mechanistic rule, and that will be our job, I think, because that is where we really don't have the knowledge, I think.
I think it's promising. I mean, you talked about the issue of transferring the neural network information from experiment to model, and of course there's the pre-training the other way, right? So that of course of training on a simulated slice and then trying to extrapolate to doing the analysis of the experiment. I mean, this comes back to the issue that I think is critical in terms of standards, which is that if you want to be able to populate your model with cells, I mean, populate your experimental data set with cells to make a simulation, you have to be able to package a description of the simulation in terms of the cell agents. And that's not so easy to do. In fact, that's why I was late to this meeting, because I was at a discussion of this. But I think it might actually be really interesting if you could ask the question, if you were going to do this, and this could be for HCA or something else, it doesn't have to be for the histology. But if I took a histology slide and I wanted to create an executable simulation from the histology slide, suppose you would run your beautiful analysis codes, you tell us all the cell types. What should the simulation structure look like that would be maximally compatible with that? In other words, if I wanted to build a workflow where I took my pathology slide and I use your method, we do the analysis, it tells me which cell types, what their states are, and so on. Now what do I do? What would the computational architecture look like that would enable that to go forward to do a simulation?
Computationally, I'm not sure. What I have in mind is that if we have the image of these, all right, this is an epithelium, and not very healthy, I think, but I think it's still in the normal shape. And the first thing we want to have is probably a model of a normal epithelium, which we already parameterized, which we have filled with our prior knowledge that we know from the literature, and we might not know enough of the normal model. And again, this is where I link with microphysiological system, because there you can measure the dynamics. That's why I think they are kind of better than in vivo. In vivo, you can measure the dynamic, but it's very expensive. And you might not have the chance to do so many experiments. So, but going back to the computation, the first thing we'll be doing a normal epithelium, and then trying to see which are, or mechanistically, there are hypotheses on why a certain cell behave in a different way, and we might impose a behavior, typical behavior of a cancer cell, and we, starting with what is known already, and then progressively, I'm not saying that is, I don't think is a work that will be very beneficial trying to do all at once, because it's humongous, it's too big. Perhaps I'm pessimist, but if we have to do everything, we have to do every epithelium of every kind. This is, okay, I'm talking about, but this is oral squamous cell carcinoma of certain very specific type, and they look like this. And all epithelia in the body look differently. So initially, I think what is useful in the next future is start having some solid models of health, and where we notice that we are missing something, I will use software like Computational to do that, or the like, where you can appreciate the spatial relationship between cells. That's obviously I took it for given, but I didn't say actually. And then we also have to think about how many cells we can encompass within a single simulation. So if it would be good to have, for example, these tissues probably 300 cells, 200 cells. So let's say that we have 10,000 slices of this, of my patient that is behaving a certain way. Well, we can have the simulation of its normal epithelium and then map it to the pathology in different places, and then map it to the simulated normal epithelium in different conditions, again, as we said before. And then I think the interesting link is really the bridging comes with in vitro or in vivo, but basically the in vitro, I think, well, is also what I do. So obviously I'm bringing water to my meal, but I think it can really help us saying, okay, what happens in an epithelium if I change just this tiny bit? Normally, if we do in vivo, we change a lot. We give the tumor, after 10 days, we look and we see what happens. In vitro, we can look dynamically what happens. Maybe a proxy, obviously, won't be a fully fledged epithelium, but we're getting very interesting results from that. And so the useful thing in analyzing these automatically is that these maps, as such, they are directly transferable to a software like Computational. The rules that move the cells are a little bit more complicated, but we can start with the standard model that already exists and been created by many authors, and then try to complicate them further. So to get, we might even ask, do we need 3D? We do need, or we don't need 3D? Well, it was, for example, this kind of data that we have are completely 2D. It might be argued that really you are not seeing the cell, but a kind of snapshot at a certain random Z plane of that cell. So it might be absolutely, and you say that the shape tells you what it is. And what if you just cut the pole of the cells? It would be, so it's all to be looked with some kind of confidence, some kind of consideration about what we are really seeing, that is not the absolute truth, but a representation of the truth. And so we have to build the bridges of these representations so that everything flows coherently, in my opinion. I don't know if that makes sense.